Gresham's Adam, and welcome back to Gresham Reads. Forgive me, I stumbled over my words. Welcome back to Gresham Reads. This time, we will be reading a much longer story. We will be reading Graceling by Kristin Cashore. Now, these will be much shorter, as I will be taking this one chapter at a time. And as there are, from what I understand, 40 chapters, if I count the epilogue. So, I do hope you're eager for this story, as Darkus has informed me that he has found this story quite intriguing. As well as I believe he referred to it as a spiritual prequel, or perhaps he referred to it just as a prequel. I would have to ask him. It's technically a prequel. Ah, I see. And the prequel was known as Fire, I believe, with the sequel to Graceling being Bitter Blue, who, if Darkus informs me correctly, is the name of a character? Yep. Bitter Blue is a character who you get to meet later on in this story. Very well. Anyways, let us begin, shall we? Excuse me for just one moment. I need to adjust this slightly. There we go. Alright, it should be picking up the music a little bit easier, a little bit more now. So, let us begin. Part 1, The Ladykiller. Chapter 1. In these dungeons, the darkness was complete, but Katsa had a map in her mind. One that had so far proven correct, as Ol's maps tended to do. Katsa ran her hand along the cold walls, and counted doors and passageways as she went, turning when it was time to turn, stopping finally before an opening that should contain a stairway leading down. She crouched and felt forward with her hands. There was a stone step, damp and slippery with moss, and another one below it. This was Ol's staircase, then. She only hoped that when he and Gideon followed her with their torches, they would see the moss slime, tread carefully, and not wake the dead by clattering headlong down the steps. Katsa slunk down the stairway, one left turn and 2 right turns. She began to hear voices as she entered a corridor, where the darkness flickered orange with the light of a torch set in the wall. Across from the torch was another corridor where, according to Ol, anywhere from 2 to 10 guards should be standing watch before a certain cell at the passageway's end. These guards were Katsa's mission. It was for them that she had been sent first. Katsa crept toward the light and the sound of laughter. She could stop and listen to get a better sense of how many she would face. But there was no time. She pulled her hood down low and swung around the corner. She almost tripped over her first 4 victims, who were sitting on the floor across from each other, their backs against the wall, legs splayed, the air stinking with whatever strong drink they'd brought down here to pass the time of their watch. Katsa kicked and struck at temples and necks, and the 4 men lay slumped together on the floor before amazement had even registered in their eyes. There was only one more guard, sitting before the cell bars at the end of the corridor. He scrambled to his feet and slid his sword from its sheath. Quetzal walked toward him, certain that the torch at her back hid her face, and particularly her eyes, from his sight. She measured his size, the way he moved, the steadiness of the arm that held the sword toward her. "Stop there. It's clear enough what you are." His voice was even. He was brave, this one. He cut the air with his sword in warning. "You don't frighten me." He lunged towards her. She ducked under his blade and whirled her foot out, clipping his temple. He dropped to the ground. She stepped over him and ran to the bars, squinting in the darkness of the cell. A shape huddled against the back wall. A person, too tired or too cold to care about the fighting going on. Arms wrapped around legs and head tucked between knees. He was shivering. She could hear his breath. She shifted, and the light glanced over his crouched form. His hair was white and cut close to his head. She saw the glimmer of gold in his ear. Ol's maps had served them well, for this man was a Lynid. He was the one they were looking for. She pulled on the door latch. Locked. Well, that was no surprise, and it wasn't her problem. She whistled once, low, like an owl. She stretched the brave guard flat on his back and dropped one of her pills into his mouth. She ran up the corridor, turned the four unfortunates on their backs beside each other, and dropped a pill into each mouth. Just as she was beginning to wonder if Ol and Gideon had lost themselves in the dungeons, they appeared around the corner and slipped past her. "A quarter hour, no more," she said. "A quarter hour, my lady." Ol's voice was a rumble. "Go safely." Their torchlight splashed the walls as they approached the cell. The Lynid man moaned and drew his arms in closer. Katsa caught a glimpse of his torn, stained clothing. She heard Gideon's ring of lockpicks clink against itself. She would have liked to have waited to see that they opened the door, but she was needed elsewhere. She tucked her packet of pills into her sleeve and ran. The cell guards reported to the dungeon guard, and the dungeon guard reported to the underguard. The underguard reported to the castle guard. The night guard, the king's guard, the wall guard, and the garden guard also reported to the castle guard. As soon as one guard noticed another's absence, the alarm would be raised, and if Katsa and her men weren't far enough away, all would be lost. They would be pursued. It would come to bloodshed. They would see her eyes, and she would be recognized. So she had to get them all, every guard. Ol had guessed there would be 20. Prince Raffin had made her 30 pills, just in case. Most of the guards gave her no trouble. If she could sneak up on them, or if they were crowded in small groups, they never knew what hit them. The castle guard was a bit more complicated, because 5 guards defended his office. She swirled through the lot of them, kicking and kneeing and hitting, and the castle guard jumped up from his guardhouse desk, burst through the door, and ran into the fray. "I know a Graceling when I see one." He jabbed with his sword, and she rolled out of the way. "Let me see the color of your eyes, boy. I'll cut them out. Don't think I won't." It gave her some pleasure to knock him on the head with the hilt of her knife. She grabbed his hair, dragged him onto his back, and dropped a pill onto his tongue. They would all say when they woke to their headaches and their shame that the culprit had been a Graceling boy, graced with fighting, acting alone. They would assume she was a boy, because in her plain trousers and hood, she looked like one. And because when people were attacked, it never occurred to anyone that it might have been a girl. And none of them had caught a glimpse of Ol or Gideon. She had seen to that. No one would think of her. Whatever the Graceling Lady Katsa might be, she was not a criminal who lurked around dark courtyards at midnight, disguised. And besides, she was supposed to be en route east. Her uncle Randa, king of the Midlands, had seen her off just that morning, the whole city watching, with Captain Ol and Gideon, Randa's underlord, escorting her. Only a day of very hard riding in the wrong direction could have brought her south to King Murgon's court. Katsa ran through the courtyard, past flower beds, fountains, and marble statues of Murgon. It was quite a pleasant courtyard, really, for such an unpleasant king. It smelled of grass and rich soil, and the sweetness of dew-dripped flowers. She raced through Murgon's apple orchard, a trail of drugged guards stretching out behind her. Drugged, not dead, an important distinction. Ol and Gideon and most of the rest of the secret council had wanted her to kill them, but at the meeting to plan this mission, she argued that killing them would gain no time. "What if they wake?" Gideon had said. Prince Raffin had been offended. "You doubt my medicine? They won't wake." "It would be faster to kill them," Gideon had said, his brown eyes insistent. Heads in the dark room had nodded. "I can do it in the time allotted," Katsa had said, and when Gideon had started to protest, she held up her hand. "Enough. I won't kill them. Even if you want to kill them, you can send someone else." Ol had smiled and clapped the young lord on the back. "Just think, Lord Gideon, it'll make more fun for us. The perfect robbery. Past all of Murgon's guards and nobody hurt. It's a good game." The room had erupted with laughter, but Katsa hadn't even cracked a smile. She wouldn't kill. Not if she didn't have to. A killing couldn't be undone, and she'd killed enough. Mostly for her uncle. King Randa thought her useful. When border ruffians were stirring up trouble, why send an army if you could send a single representative? It was much more economical. But she'd killed for the council too. When it couldn't be avoided. This time, it could be avoided. At the far end of the orchard, she came upon a guard who was old. As old, perhaps, as the Lynid. He stood in a grove of yearling trees, leaning on a sword, his back round and bent. She snuck up behind him and paused. A tremor shook the hands that rested on the hilt of his blade. She didn't think much of a king who didn't retire his guards in comfort when they had gotten too old to hold a sword steady. But if she left him, he would find the others she had felled and raise the alarm. She struck him once, hard, on the back of the head, and he slumped and let out a puff of air. She caught him and lowered him to the ground as gently as she could, and then dropped a pill into his mouth. She took a moment to run her fingers along the lump forming on his skull. She hoped his head was strong. She had killed once by accident, a memory she held close to her consciousness. It was how her grace had announced its nature a decade ago. She had been a child, barely 8 years old. A man who was some sort of distant cousin had visited the court. She hadn't liked him. His heavy perfume, the way he leered at the girls who served him, the way his leer followed them around the room, the way he touched them when he thought no one was watching. When he'd started to pay Katsa some attention, she had grown wary. "Such a pretty little one," he'd said. "Graceling eyes can be so very unattractive, but you, lucky girl, look better for it. What's your grace, my sweetness? Storytelling? Mind-reading? I know, you're a dancer." Katsa hadn't known what her grace was. Some graces took longer than others to surface, but even if she had known, she wouldn't have cared to discuss it with this cousin. She scowled at the man and turned away, but then his hand had slid toward her leg, and her hand had flown out and smashed him in the face. So hard and so fast, she'd pushed the bones of his nose into his brain. Ladies in the court had screamed. One had fainted. When they lifted him from the pool of blood on the floor, and he turned out to be dead, the court had grown silent, backed away. Frightened eyes, not just those of the ladies now, but those of the soldiers, the sordid underlords, all directed at her. It was fine to eat the meals of the king's chef, who was graced with cooking, or send their horses to the king's graced horse doctor. But a girl graced with killing? This one was not safe. Another king would have banished her, or killed her, even if she was his sister's child. But Randa was clever. He could see that in time, his niece might serve a practical purpose. He sent her to her chambers, and kept her there for weeks as punishment, but that was all. When she emerged, they all ran to get out of her path. They'd never liked her before, for no one liked the graced, but at least they tolerated her presence. Now there was no pretense of friendliness. "Watch out for the blue-eyed, green-eyed one," they would whisper to guests. "She killed her cousin with one strike because he complimented her eyes." Even Randa kept out of her way. A murderous dog might be useful to a king, but he didn't want it sleeping at his feet. Prince Raffin was the only one who sought her company. "You won't do it again, will you? I don't think my father will let you kill anyone you want." "I never meant to kill him," she said. "What happened?" Katsa sent her mind back. "I felt like I was in danger, so I hit him." Prince Raffin shook his head. "You need to control a grace, especially a killing grace. You must, or my father will stop us seeing each other." This was a frightening notion. "I don't know how to control it." Raffin considered this. You could ask Ol. The king's spies know how to hurt without killing. It's how they get information. Raffin was 11, 3 years Katsa's senior, and by her young standards, very wise. She took his advice and went to Ol, King Randa's grain captain, and his spy master. Ol wasn't foolish. He knew to fear the quiet girl with one eye blue and one eye green. But he also had some imagination. He wondered, as it had occurred to no one else to wonder, whether Katsa hadn't been just as shocked by her cousin's death as everyone else. And the more he thought about it, the more curious he became about her potential. He started their training by setting rules. She would not practice on him, and she would not practice on any of the king's men. She would practice on dummies that she made out of sacks sewn together and filled with grain. She would practice on the prisoners that all brought to her, men whose deaths were already decreed. She practiced every day. She learned her own speed and her own explosive force. She learned the angle, position, and intensity of a killing blow versus a maiming blow. She learned how to disarm a man and how to break his leg, and how to twist his arm so severely that he would stop struggling and beg for release. She learned to fight with a sword and with knives and daggers. She was so fast and focused, so creative, she could find a way to beat a man senseless with both arms tied to her sides. Such was her grace. In time, her control improved, and she began to take practice with Miranda's soldiers, 8 or 10 at a time, and in full suits of armor. Her practices were a spectacle, grown men grunting and clattering around clumsily, an unarmed child whirling and diving among them, knocking them down with a knee or a hand that they didn't see coming until they were already on the floor. Sometimes members of the court would come by to watch her practices, but if she caught their gaze, their eyes would drop and they would hurry on. King Randa had not minded the sacrifice of Ol's time. He thought it necessary. Katsa wouldn't be useful if she remained uncontrolled. And now in King Murgon's courtyard, no one could criticize her control. She moved across the grass beside the gravel paths, swiftly, soundlessly. By now Ol and Gideon must have reached the garden wall, where the 2 Murgon servants, friends of the council, guarded their horses. She was nearly there herself. She saw the dark line ahead, black against a black sky. Her thoughts rambled, but she wasn't daydreaming. Her senses were sharp. She caught the fall of every leaf in the garden, the rustle of every branch. And so she was astonished when a man stepped out of the darkness and grabbed her from behind. He wrapped his arm around her chest and held a knife to her throat. He started to speak, but in an instant she had deadened his arm, wrenched the knife from his hand, and thrown the blade to the ground. She flung him forward over her shoulders. He landed on his feet. Her mind raced. He was graced. A fighter. That much was clear. And unless he had no feeling in that hand that raked her chest, he knew she was a woman. He turned back to face her. They eyed each other warily, each no more than a shadow to the other. He spoke. "I've heard of a lady with this particular grace." His voice was gravelly and deep. There was a lilt to his words. It was not an accent, she knew. She must learn who he was, so that she could know what to do with him. "I can't think what that lady would be doing so far from home, running through the courtyard of King Murgon at midnight." He shifted slightly, placed himself between her and the wall. He was taller than she was, and smooth in his movements, like a cat. Deceptively calm, ready to spring. A torch on the path nearby caught the glimmer of small gold hoops in his ears, and his face was unbearded, like a linnet. She shifted and swayed, her body ready, like his. She didn't have much time to decide. He knew who she was. But if he was a linnet, She didn't want to kill him. "Don't you have anything to say, lady? Surely you don't think I'll let you pass without an explanation?" There was something playful in his voice. She watched him quietly. He stretched his arms in one fluid motion, and her eyes unraveled the bands of gold that gleamed on his fingers. It was enough. The hoops in his ears, the rings, the lilt in his words. It was enough. "You're a Lynid." "You have good eyesight." "Not good enough to see the colors of your eyes." He laughed. "I think I know the colors of yours." Common sense told her to kill him. "You're one to speak of being far from home," she said. "What's a Lynid doing in the court of King Murgon?" "I'll tell you my reasons if you tell me yours." "I'll tell you nothing, and you must let me pass."
"Must I?"
"If you don't, I'll have to force you."
"Do you think you can?"
She faked to her right, and he swung away easily. She did it again, faster. Again, he escaped her easily. He was very good, but she was Katsa. "I know I can," she said.
"Ah,"
his voice was amused.
"But it might take you hours."
Why was he playing with her? Why wasn't he raising the alarm? Perhaps he was a criminal himself, a Graceling criminal. And if so, did that make him an ally or an enemy? Wouldn't a Lynid approve of her rescue of the Lynid prisoner? Yes, unless he was a traitor. Or unless this Lynid didn't even know the contents of Murgon's dungeon. Murgon had kept a secret well. The council would tell her to kill him. The council will tell her she put them at risk if she left a man alive who knew her identity. But he was unlike any thug she had ever encountered. He didn't feel brutish or stupid or threatening. She couldn't kill one Lynid while rescuing another. She was a fool, and she would probably regret it, but she wouldn't do it.
"I trust you,"
he said suddenly. He stepped out of the path and waved her forward. She thought him very strange and impulsive, but she saw he'd relaxed his guard, and she wasn't one to waste an opportunity. In an instant, she swung her boot up and clipped him on the forehead. His eyes opened wide with surprise, and he dropped to the ground. Maybe I didn't have to do that. She stretched him out, his sleeping limbs heavy. But I don't know what to think of you, and I've already risked enough already, letting you live. She dug the pills out of her sleeve, dropped one into his mouth. She turned his face to the torchlight. He was younger than she'd thought. Not much older than she, 19 or 20 at most. A trickle of blood ran down his forehead, past his ear. The neck of his shirt was open, and the torchlight played along the line of his collarbone. What a strange character. Maybe Raffin would know who he was. She shook herself. They would be waiting. She ran. They rode hard. They tied the old man to his horse, for he was too weak to hold himself up. They stopped only once to wrap him in more blankets. Katsa was impatient to keep moving. Doesn't he know it's midsummer?
"He's frozen through, my lady. He's shivering. He's ill. It's no use if our rescue kills him."
They talked about stopping, building a fire, but there was no time.
They had to reach Randa City before daybreak, or they would be discovered. Perhaps I should have killed him, she thought as they thundered through the dark forests. Perhaps I should have killed him. He knew who I was. But he hadn't seemed threatening or suspicious. He'd been more curious than anything. He'd trusted her. Then again, he hadn't known about the trail of drugged guards she had left in her wake. And he wouldn't trust her once he woke to that welt on his head. Forgive me for that. My throat is feeling a little dry. If he told King Murgon of their encounter, and if Murgon told King Randa, things could get very tricky for the Lady Katsa. Randa knew nothing of the lioned prisoner, much less of Katsa moonlighting as a rescuer. Katsa shook herself in frustration. These thoughts were no help, and it was done now. They needed to get the grandfather to safety and warmth, and Raffen. She crouched lower in her saddle and urged her horse north. Well, that was chapter 1 of Graceling. I do hope you all enjoyed. So far, I am agreeing with what Darkus has said. This story is quite interesting. I find the idea of these Gracelings to be unique. Individuals with what is known as heterochromia, all possessing a unique talent. Anything from a basic enhancement to a practical skill to something supernatural, such as reading minds. It is fascinating, and I'm curious to see where this story will go. Anyways, I will not take too much time. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and a comment down below telling your favorite part, as well as offering suggestions for when I finish this story. If you enjoy the content that we put out, be sure to subscribe to Darkus' channel and hit the notification bell so that you always know when Darkus, myself, or, well, no, Ghost is simply a storyteller. Darkus is uploading his videos, so when Darkus or myself upload videos. In the meantime, I will see you all in the next video. I am Gresham Reads, and I am signing out.